For decades, gearheads swapped the same whispered legend. Somewhere behind the locked doors of Smokey Yunick's Daytona Beach workshop sat outlawed engines, banned blueprints, and secrets so dangerous that NASCAR itself wanted them to disappear. It's a great story. It's also almost entirely wrong. When the doors of the best damn garage in town finally opened to the public, what came out wasn't a government cover-up. It was something far stranger, and in its own way, far more impressive. Proof that one stubborn mechanic in Florida had quietly out-engineered Detroit for half a century, and nobody wanted to listen. Smokey Yunick passed away on May 9, 2001, at age 77, after a year-long fight with leukemia, at his home in Daytona Beach. He'd already shut the garage's doors back in 1987, telling anyone who asked that there simply weren't enough good mechanics left worth training. For years after that, the building sat mostly frozen, a time capsule nobody had touched. It wasn't until the following year that his family finally began sorting through what he'd left behind, at the address on North Beach Street that racing fans had treated as sacred ground since 1947. What they found wasn't a laboratory. It was a life's work in the shape of clutter. During Speed Weeks in February 2002, Smokey's widow, Marge Yunick, opened the shop to the public for a multi-day sale. People didn't need clearance or connections. They just needed to show up. And show up they did, driving in from Maine, from Oregon, from anywhere a fan could scrape together gas money, all chasing the chance to walk away with a physical piece of a man who'd spent his life bending the rules of what a car or an engine was supposed to be able to do. The inventory was a strange mix of the mundane and the miraculous. $5 fender hammers sat next to $20 boxes of loose racing parts. There were stacks of old hubcaps, coils of exhaust pipe, a vintage 1950s GMC dealership sign, and Smokey's own well-worn manual typewriter. And then, almost hiding in plain sight among the junk, sat a hand-built engine with a sticker price of $20,000 and a claim that sounded almost like a joke, 80 miles per gallon. Marge Yunick had a phrase for the whole operation that stuck with everyone who heard it. They were, in her words, a junkyard, but a first-class junkyard. She wasn't being modest. She was describing exactly what her husband would have wanted. Smokey had never cared about being enshrined behind velvet rope in some climate-controlled museum. He wanted his tools back in someone's hands, actually being used, or at least owned by a fan who'd treasure the history in them rather than let them gather dust as untouchable relics. That instinct made sense coming from a man who'd spent his whole career rescuing forgotten machines and coaxing them back to life. The last thing he wanted was to become a forgotten machine himself, locked away and admired from a distance. The money raised from the sale wasn't pocketed. It went toward a foundation meant to keep funding motorsports innovation, a fitting way to keep his restless, experimental spirit alive even after he was gone. His daughter, Trish Yunick Brown, put it best. While collectors and fans lined up for the physical objects, she said she was holding on to something the auction couldn't touch: his stories. Her husband, Chris Brown, had his own shorthand for the man, calling him NASCAR's wildest cheater, not as an insult, but as an acknowledgement. Smokey didn't break rules so much as he found the cracks in them, and every time he slipped through one, the sport had to rewrite its rulebook to close the gap. That's really the whole story in miniature. Instead of secret seizures or midnight raids by suspicious officials, the great unveiling of Smokey Yunick's garage was a public swap meet where anyone with cash in their pocket could walk out with a $5 hammer or a radical, Detroit-defying engine sitting in the same dusty room. The building itself didn't survive much longer. The property sold in 2003, and the last remaining structure burned down in a fire on April 25, 2011. But by then, none of that mattered. The real legacy was already scattered across garages, private collections, and museum floors all over the country. Buried among the tools and hubcaps were the machines that proved this wasn't just nostalgia. It was unfinished science. The most remarkable of them ran on something called the hot vapor cycle, a concept Smokey and his collaborators had chased for decades, quietly cracking a problem that entire teams of Detroit engineers had tested, verified, and then simply abandoned. The demonstration car was a modified Pontiac Fiero, built around a 2.5-liter Iron Duke four-cylinder engine. In its stock factory form, that engine made about 90 horsepower and returned roughly 35 miles per gallon on the highway. Respectable, unremarkable numbers for the era. Smokey's carbureted version of the same engine turned that equation upside down. 250 horsepower, 250 pound-feet of torque, a 0 to 60 run of around 6.5 seconds. And this is the part that sounds impossible. 51 miles per gallon running on 93 octane pump gas. The trick wasn't computer management, because there wasn't any computer involved at all. Instead, Smokey leaned on something called adiabatic combustion. Rather than cooling the incoming air-fuel mixture the way every conventional engine does, he did the opposite. He captured waste heat from the exhaust and coolant and used it to actively boil the fuel mixture before combustion. That superheated vapor was pushed through an exhaust-driven turbine, nicknamed the homogenizer, mounted beneath the carburetor, then routed through a heavily insulated, wrapped manifold until temperatures climbed past 450 degrees Fahrenheit. By the time the mixture reached the cylinders, the fuel had fully vaporized, letting the engine run at an extraordinarily lean air-to-fuel ratio, leaner than 20-to-1, well beyond what most engines of the era could tolerate without misfiring or melting something. And crucially, independent Detroit labs and OEM engineers actually verified these numbers themselves. This wasn't a shop floor rumor. The engine met strict 1980s emissions standards without a single microchip anywhere near it. The idea didn't start with Smokey alone. Its roots traced back to the 1950s and a Holley carburetor specialist and GM dyno technician named Ralph Johnson, who partnered with Smokey to push combustion past the normal detonation threshold most engineers treated as an absolute ceiling. They ran exhaust temperatures as high as 2,250 degrees to control the hydrogen burn process, operating right at the ragged edge of what the hardware could survive. Johnson had a blunt way of summarizing their lean burn tuning. The engine never ran better than it did in the moments right before it destroyed itself. That's not a small caveat. It's the whole reason Detroit walked away. Between the two of them, Smokey and Johnson built several hot vapor prototypes beyond the Fiero, including a 3-cylinder Buick conversion, a modified Ford, and a Dodge Omni. Every single one of these test mules cleared 45 miles per gallon, while producing close to 2 horsepower per cubic inch, numbers that would still turn heads in a modern economy car. There were real, serious attempts to bring the technology to production, including a proposed S-10 pickup truck program and a licensing arrangement with Crane Cams. None of it stuck. The technology collapsed under the weight of durability concerns, legal costs, high manufacturing overhead, and a very human obstacle: the industry's stubborn resistance to any good idea that didn't originate inside its own walls. But the hardware itself refused to disappear. Trish Yunick kept 4 of the surviving hot vapor engines in the family. A dedicated enthusiast named Tony Allers later acquired the running examples and, using the salvaged original drivetrain, built a fully restored, road-legal Fiero replica that he actually drove as a daily vehicle for years. Not a museum piece, a working car. On Christmas Day in 2009, Allers donated that very car to the Don Garlits Museum of Drag Racing, where it remains on display today. Another surviving unit is reportedly held by the Smithsonian Institution. Sit with that for a second. A carbureted 4-cylinder from the 1980s, hitting 250 horsepower and 51 miles per gallon while meeting federal emissions law. And the reason most people have never heard of it isn't that it failed. It's that nobody with enough money wanted to admit someone outside their own building had solved it first. Not everything Smokey built stayed secret until his death. A good portion of it is sitting in plain sight in U.S. Patent and Trademark Office records, which show he filed and secured at least 9 patents between 1978 and 1996. Patents exist as a kind of legal timestamp, official proof of exactly when an idea was born, and Smokey's paper trail reads like a running argument with an industry that kept telling him no. His hot vapor research alone generated a cluster of these filings. Between 1984 and 1988, he locked down patents covering the specific apparatus, the operating methods, and the fuel conditioning systems behind the technology that powered his Fiero experiments. Those patents entered the public domain around 2003, meaning any engineer curious enough to look could study the underlying mechanics for themselves. Beyond the fuel work, his filings ranged surprisingly wide. A pressure vent patent in 1978, an oil change system patent in 1991, and an engine testing methodology patent in 1994. His most bitter fights with racing officials, though, weren't about fuel at all. They were about safety and aerodynamics, two areas where NASCAR's caution and Smokey's impatience collided again and again. In 1961, he designed pneumatic air jacks meant to lift a stock car instantly during a pit stop, a genuinely clever piece of engineering that sanctioning bodies simply rejected as inappropriate for the series at the time. A year later, he mounted an oversized wing over the engine of Jim Rathman's Simon's Vista Special Watson Roadster for the Indy 500. It generated tremendous downforce and dramatically improved cornering. And just as quickly, it created enough straightaway drag that the United States Auto Club banned it outright. Decades later, of course, wings became mandatory, standard equipment across Can-Am, Formula One, and IndyCar. The most painful delay of all involved crash safety. In the early 1980s, long before anything resembling the modern safer barrier existed, Smokey proposed a primitive soft wall concept. Layers of old tires sandwiched between heavy plywood sheets, designed to absorb impact energy instead of simply stopping a car dead against solid concrete. NASCAR didn't adopt it. Drivers kept racing against unforgiving concrete walls for years afterward. Smokey never let the idea die on paper, though. He eventually formalized his safety research into a 1996 patent specifically describing a racetrack design incorporating a novel crash barrier. It's hard not to wonder how many injuries, or worse, might have been prevented if that idea had been taken seriously in 1982 instead of being reinvented, essentially from scratch, decades later. If there's one image that defines Smokey Yunick's reputation, it's the photograph of him standing beside his Chevelle, cigar in his teeth, that crooked grin on his face. The car, popular legend insists, was built at 7/8 scale, to sneak past NASCAR's rules. It's a fantastic story. It's also demonstrably false, and the actual measurements prove it. A true 7/8 scale car would have been roughly 10 inches narrower, more than 2 feet shorter overall, and built on a 100-inch wheelbase. Differences so obvious that any inspector walking past it in the garage would have caught it instantly. The real story is more interesting precisely because it's more subtle. The cars in question were three 1966 bodied Chevelles, often mislabeled online as 1967 models, that started with legitimate developmental groundwork from Chevrolet's own engineering division before Smokey took over the finishing touches. What he actually did was reshape the aerodynamics through a series of small, deliberate geometry shifts, rather than any change in overall size. He moved the body roughly 2 inches rearward on the chassis to rebalance weight distribution. He smoothed and subtly raised the floor pan to control airflow underneath the car. He lowered the roofline and window openings by a hair, laid the windshield back at a sharper rake, and reworked the fenders and drip rails. He even reshaped the front bumper, extending it taller so it functioned almost like a built-in aerodynamic spoiler. The sheet metal itself stayed largely stock. It was the underlying geometry that had been sculpted, and at speeds above 180 miles per hour, differences that small translate into a massive real-world advantage. NASCAR inspectors eventually realized something was off, though they couldn't immediately say what. Their first attempt at solving the mystery involved using a wrecked Chevelle, formerly driven by Bobby Johns, as a physical reference pattern for inspection. It didn't work well enough, and the confusion it caused ultimately forced NASCAR to introduce standardized roof, hood, and trunk templates across the entire field. The beginning of the body template inspection system the sport still uses today. And the engineering behind it wasn't just clever on paper. It worked on the track. Driving one of these cars, Curtis Turner became the first driver ever to qualify at over 180 miles per hour at Daytona. Smokey himself pushed back on the scale model myth directly, addressing it in a 1987 Circle Track magazine feature and later again in his own autobiography, insisting the real modifications were far more calculated than a simple shrink ray story could explain. This was, in miniature, exactly how Smokey approached the entire sport. He lived in the gray areas by design. He once famously exploited fuel capacity limits by running 11-foot coils of 2-inch tubing as his car's fuel line, quietly adding roughly 5 extra gallons of usable fuel capacity beyond what a straight line would have held. Racing folklore is full of stories about cars with subtly offset chassis components and suspiciously empty fuel tanks right after post-race inspections. Smokey's own explanation for this pattern was blunt. He figured everyone else in the garage was cheating at least 10 times worse than he was, so pushing the rules himself was really just self-defense. While fans were hauling off hammers and museums were arranging to display the surviving engines, the most complete record of who Smokey actually was sat in a manuscript he raced to finish before leukemia caught up with him. Running over 1,100 pages, it was published posthumously around 2001 under the title Best Damn Garage in Town, self-released through carbon press together with his family as a massive 3-volume boxed set containing more than 400 photographs. The set was organized into distinct sections covering his personal life, his career in stock car racing, and his Indianapolis 500 entries and engineering projects. Automotive legend John DeLorean even narrated the audiobook version, adding another layer of insider credibility to a story that needed no embellishment to begin with. Inside those pages, Smokey finally laid out the tragedy that had pushed him away from NASCAR entirely. In 1964, his close friend Fireball Roberts was critically injured in a crash and fire at Charlotte, dying 40 days later from his injuries. The loss transformed Smokey into an aggressive advocate for driver safety, particularly around fuel cell design. When NASCAR founder Bill France Sr. repeatedly overruled his safety proposals, Smokey walked away from the organization entirely around 1970, a rupture that shaped the rest of his career. The book also revealed an unexpected gap between memory and official record regarding his military service. Smokey maintained throughout his life that he'd flown more than 50 combat missions aboard a B-17 bomber. National Archives records tell a somewhat different story. He was drafted in 1943 as a welder and served on active duty from 1944 to 1946. That said, the records do confirm he reached the rank of second lieutenant and earned an Air Medal while serving with the 15th Air Force, a genuinely decorated service record, even if the specific details differed from the story he told. Whatever gaps existed in the retelling, his actual racing resume needed no exaggeration. He amassed 57 Cup Series wins, claimed 2 championships as a car owner and crew chief, and stood in victory lane at the 1960 Indianapolis 500 as a master mechanic. He was also the first car owner to win back-to-back Daytona 500s in 1961 and 1962. By the time of his death, he'd been inducted into more than 30 separate halls of fame, including the inaugural class of the International Motorsports Hall of Fame in 1990 and the Motorsports Hall of Fame of America in 2000. The old building itself couldn't outlast him by much. The property sold in 2003. Most of the original structures came down not long after, and the last remaining piece of the best damn garage in town burned to the ground on April 25, 2011. But by the time the fire took the building, everything that actually mattered had already walked out the door years earlier. Tony Allers's restored, road-driven hot vapor Fiero sits today in the Don Garlits Museum of Drag Racing, donated on Christmas Day in 2009. Smokey's family still holds 4 of the original prototype engines. A private collector owns the hot vapor Dodge Horizon prototype, complete with a signed bill of sale documenting its provenance. Allers himself retains a set of original garage tools, along with one of the actual shop doors. Another engine reportedly remains on long-term loan to the Smithsonian. His name still appears in more than 30 motorsports halls of fame, and his hats, pipes, and personal garage equipment sit in display cases scattered across private and public collections nationwide. But the truest monuments to Smokey Yunick aren't objects at all. They're rules. Every standardized body template used in modern NASCAR inspection traces its lineage directly back to that quietly reshaped Chevelle. Aerodynamic wings and pneumatic pit lane jacks, both of which he was experimenting with decades before either became standard, are now required equipment across multiple major racing series. His crude tire and plywood soft wall concept laid the intellectual groundwork that eventually led to the safer barriers protecting drivers today. And his hot vapor pens, sitting quietly in the public domain, continue to be studied by engineers chasing better thermal efficiency, decades after Detroit first walked away from the same ideas. The real inventory pulled from Smokey Yunick's garage after his death is a far better story than any locked vault rumor could ever be. Not because it's mysterious, but because it's true. The sale receipts, the running prototypes, the patent filings, the 1,100-page autobiography, and the rulebook pages his cars quietly forced NASCAR to rewrite all point to the same conclusion. He wasn't hiding secrets from the world. He was just years ahead of it, and most of the world simply hadn't caught up yet.